On the 22nd of December 1960, a pale green Morris Minor rolled off the production line at Cowley with a small ceremony attached to it. It was not a particularly special car in any mechanical sense, a four-door saloon in the specification that most buyers ordered, finished in a color that was common enough to suggest fleet use. But it was the 1 millionth Morris Minor to be built, and that fact made it the first British car ever to reach that production milestone. Nuffield organization employees lined the factory floor. Alec Issigonis, the man who had designed it 12 years earlier, was present. The photographs of the occasion show people who look, without exaggeration, proud. The Morris Minor 1000 that reached that milestone was a car that had been in production since 1956. Itself, the culmination of a development program that had started with Issigonis's original 800-and-something cc design in 1948. By 1960, it had been refined into what most people who know this car consider its definitive form. The 948cc engine, the one-piece windscreen, the larger rear window. The specification that gave the Minor the engine it had arguably always deserved, and the visibility that made it a pleasure to place on a road. The Minor would continue in production for another 11 years after that millionth car rolled out of Cowley. And in those 11 years, something happened that turns what should be a straightforward celebration of one of Britain's greatest cars into something considerably more complicated. Because the people who inherited the Minor, the corporate successors who arrived via the mergers and reorganizations that assembled British Leyland, did not, in the end, treat it with anything approaching the care it deserved. There is a specific meeting, a specific decision, and a specific set of circumstances surrounding the Minor's final years that the official histories tend to pass over rather quickly. We will not be passing over them, but first, what the car actually was, and why, by 1960, it had earned its million. Issigonis, the Mosquito, and what the Minor was designed to do. Alec Issigonis began designing the car that would become the Morris Minor in 1943, while the Second World War was still being fought, and the question of what Britain's post-war car market would look like was entirely theoretical. He was working at Morris Motors under Lord Nuffield, and the project was internally designated the Mosquito, a name that was dropped before production began, and that survives, now, only in the notes of people who study this period of British automotive history with the attention it deserves. The design brief Issigonis set himself was more ambitious than the car's modest eventual reputation might suggest. He wanted a small car that drove like a large one, that had the handling precision, the ride quality, and the sense of structural integrity that British small cars of the pre-war period had conspicuously lacked. The pre-war Morris 8, which was the car the Minor was effectively replacing, handled like what it was, a small, lightly engineered machine built to a price with no particular ambition beyond the practical. Issigonis intended to do better. The independent front suspension that he specified, torsion bars, unequal length wishbones, a rack and pinion steering system that no British small car of the period used, produced a front end that felt, to anyone who drove the Minor alongside its contemporaries, as though it had been engineered in a different decade. The ride quality on the Minor's soft, long travel suspension was remarkable for the class and price. The steering, lighter and more communicative than anything the Morris 8 had offered, made the car feel genuinely responsive in a way that surprised drivers encountering it for the first time. The engine that Issigonis had wanted for the car, a flat 4 of his own design, mounted ahead of the front axle to give the Minor a weight distribution that the final production car, never quite achieved, was rejected by Morris management on cost grounds. The car was launched in 1948 with the pre-war 918cc side-valve engine from the Morris 8, an engine that Issigonis had explicitly not wanted, and which produced around 27 brake horsepower. The Minor was, from its first day, a better car than its engine deserved. That tension between the chassis that Issigonis had built and the powertrain that accountants had authorized would define the Minor's entire development story. The 803cc overhead valve A-series engine that arrived in 1952 and the 948cc version that transformed the Minor 1,000 inches, 1956, were the belated corrections to Issigonis's original frustration. The 948cc unit, producing approximately 37 brake horsepower, was not a powerful engine by any absolute measure. But in a car that weighed under 750 kilograms, with a chassis that had been designed to reward the driver rather than to forgive them, it was enough. More than enough, in the hands of someone who understood what the Miner had always been trying to be: the body variants, the traveller, and the Miner in British life. The Morris Miner was not a single car. It was a family of cars built on the same platform and sharing the same mechanical philosophy. And the breadth of that family was one of the reasons the Miner accumulated 1 million sales across a generation of British buyers. The two-door saloon was the original and remained the most common throughout production. The four-door variant arrived in 1950, extending the Miner's appeal to families for whom two doors was a practical limitation. The convertible, a genuine factory-built open car, not a coach-built conversion, gave the Miner a character that the saloon's upright proportions somewhat concealed. Driven with the hood down on a summer road, the Miner convertible offered an experience of openness and connection to the landscape that cars twice its price and 3 times its power rarely matched. But it was the traveller that made the Miner something beyond a practical small car, and that secured for it a place in the affection of the British public that no amount of sales figures fully explains. The Miner Traveller was an estate car with an exposed wooden frame forming the rear body structure ash. In the tradition of the coach-building industry that had supplied British car bodies since the beginning of the century, the wood was structural, not decorative. It was treated and maintained by owners who understood that a traveller's longevity depended on attention to the timber as much as to the mechanical components. In a car market dominated by pressed steel and the logic of the assembly line, the Traveller looked like a deliberate statement of craft. It was not, in any straightforward sense, more expensive to produce than a conventional steel-bodied estate. The timber sections replaced steel stampings that would have required tooling, investment. But it looked as though more care had gone into it, and in post-war Britain, where the Ministry of Supply had recently finished telling people what to make and when to make it, something that looked carefully made attracted a loyalty that went beyond the rational. By the late 1950s, the Miner was embedded in British life in a way that only a handful of cars have ever achieved. It was the car of the district nurse, the rural postman, the village schoolteacher, the small business owner, who needed something reliable and economical and presentable across a range of social contexts. The GPO, the General Post Office, operated a fleet of Miner vans in the distinctive pillarbox red that became one of the period's visual signatures. That institutional adoption did not diminish the Miner's domestic reputation. If anything, it confirmed it. The people who knew most about running a vehicle reliably across long distances in all weathers had chosen the Morris Miner, and that meant something. The car's visual identity contributed to that loyalty in ways that are worth stating plainly. The Miner's proportions, the wide stance relative to its height, the rounded front end, the large glass house that gave both driver and passengers a sense of being connected to the road and the landscape, were not the work of a stylist hired to make something fashionable. They were the work of an engineer who understood that a small car needed to look resolved rather than shrunken, and who had the confidence to pursue that resolution through the entire body. The Miner looked right. 40 years after production ended, it still does, and that is not something that can be said about most of its contemporaries. The mergers, British Leyland, and what happened next. The Morris Miner's institutional home changed 3 times in the decade between its launch and the millionth car milestone. Morris Motors became part of the British Motor Corporation in 1952, when Austin and Morris were merged under Leonard Lord's direction. BMC then became part of British Motor Holdings in 1966, and British Motor Holdings merged with the Leyland Motor Corporation in 1968 to form British Leyland. The Miner survived all 3 transitions in production terms. In organizational terms, each transition moved it further from the conditions that had created it. The problem that British Leyland faced with the Morris Miner by the late 1960s was not that the car had stopped selling. It was still selling modest volumes, declining from the peaks of the late 50s, but positive and consistent. The problem was a different kind of corporate logic. British Leyland had inherited a product range of staggering breadth and overlap: Austins, Morrises, Rovers, Triumphs, MGs, Jaguars, all built in different factories, with different workforces and different management cultures, all competing in markets that were not always clearly separated from one another. Rationalization was the word that appeared in every management document of the period, and rationalization meant choosing which cars to develop and which to wind down. The Minor was not going to receive development investment. The ADO 16, the car that became the Austin, Morris 1000, 100, and 1300, and that outsold everything else in Britain for most of the 1960s, was the car that BMC and then British Leyland had decided was the Minor's successor and, by implication, its replacement. The Minor and the 1000, 100 over 1000, 300 were not direct competitors in price or specification, but they overlapped enough in the market to make running both programs simultaneously feel wasteful to people who were counting costs. What followed was not a decision to kill the Minor in any single meeting or memo. It was slower and less dramatic than that, which in some ways makes it harder to fix responsibility for. Development funds were not allocated. The engine was not updated as emissions requirements tightened. The specification was frozen at what it had been in the early 1960s, while the competitive landscape shifted beneath it. The Minor was not cancelled. It was simply not supported. And the difference between those two things was, from the Minor's perspective, entirely academic. Production at Cowley continued through the late 1960s and into the early 1970s on a declining trajectory. The final Morris Minor, a Traveller, appropriately enough, came off the production line at Cowley in November of 1971. The announcement of the end of production attracted a level of public response that surprised the people who made it. Letters to the press, editorials in regional newspapers, questions in the House of Commons, which is a parliamentary response that very few discontinued car models have ever received. The public response was not irrational sentimentality, though it was sometimes described that way by people inside the industry who found it inconvenient. It was the recognition, felt more widely than most car industry decisions ever produce, that something specific had been lost, and that the people responsible for losing it had not fully understood what they were handling: legacy, the classic market, and what they are worth today. The total production of the Morris Minor across its full run from 1948 to 1971 reached approximately 1,619,000 examples, a figure drawn from the production records held by the Morris Minor Owners Club and consistent across the principal marque histories. Of that total, the Minor 1000 inches, its various body styles, accounts for the majority, the 948cc and subsequently 1098cc specifications, covering the car's most commercially successful decade. The 1098cc engine that arrived in 1962, enlarging the A-series unit from its 948cc displacement and lifting power to approximately 48 brake horsepower, was the final significant mechanical development the Minor received, and it was a genuine improvement. The 1098cc car is broadly considered the most complete version of the Minor, enough power to maintain modern traffic speeds with reasonable comfort. The handling characteristics that Issigonis had spent 20 years refining to their final form, and the body quality that came from a production process that had been building the same car long enough to have eliminated most of its original imperfections. In the classic car market today, the Morris Minor occupies territory that its production figures and its cultural significance justify entirely. The Traveller commands the strongest prices. The combination of its visual distinctiveness, the additional maintenance demands of the timber structure, and the relative scarcity of genuinely sound examples places it at the premium end of the Minor range. A well-preserved, genuine wood Traveller, in original specification with documented service history, is a car that serious collectors compete for at the specialist auction events where the best examples appear. The convertible occupies a similar premium position, particularly in original color combinations and with matching number mechanical components. The saloons, both two-door and four-door, offer the most accessible entry points to minor ownership, with a supply of honest, usable examples in the market that reflects both the volume that was built and the survival rate of a car that was well maintained by owners who formed a genuine attachment to it. The Morris Minor Owners Club, which has operated continuously since 1976, maintains a technical resource and a community knowledge base that makes the Minor one of the best supported classic cars in Britain for the private owner who intends to maintain their car themselves. Condition matters more to the Minor's value than specification in most cases. A sound, unrestored car with original paintwork and a continuous ownership history commands genuine premium over a restored example of uncertain provenance, because the restoration standard achievable by specialists has made the genuinely original car a more reliable investment than one whose history includes significant work of unknown quality. The corrosion patterns specific to the Minor, the sills, the floors, the battery tray area, and the front valance in particular, are well understood and well documented, and a pre-purchase inspection by someone familiar with where the Minor hides its problems is the standard advice that the Owners Club has given for decades, and that remains as valid today as when it was first offered. On the 22nd of December 1960, Alec Issigonis stood in a factory and watched a car he had designed 12 years earlier become the first British car to sell 1 million. 11 years later, in November of 1971, the last one came off the line, and the decision not to replace it, not the decision to replace it, because no replacement was offered, was complete. The Morris Minor did not end, because the market stopped wanting it. The letters that arrived at the offices of British Leyland after the announcement, and the parliamentary questions, and the editorials, were the market telling the manufacturer something specific, that there was still an appetite for a small, honest, well-made British car that drove the way the Minor drove, and that asked of its owner only that they maintain it with reasonable attention. British Leyland heard the message and concluded it was nostalgia. The market has spent the 50-plus years since suggesting that the conclusion was wrong. What Issigonis designed in 1943, in a company that did not yet exist in its later form, on a brief that he had substantially written himself, was a car that the British public adopted not because it was the only option available and not because it was the cheapest. The Minor was adopted because it was, within its limitations, genuinely good. The ride, the steering, the proportions that made it look right from almost any angle, these were qualities that people recognized and that they stayed loyal to across generations of production and through every corporate reorganization that threatened to end it. The people who killed it did not, in the end, understand what they were killing. That is not an unusual thing to say about decisions made in large organizations under financial pressure. It is, in the case of the Morris Minor, a more than usually accurate one. Now, I want to hear from you. Was the Morris Minor in your family as a first car, a parent's car, a car you learned to drive in, or a car that was simply present in your childhood, in the way that certain things become fixtures before you are old enough to notice them consciously? Did you own a Traveller and maintain the wood yourself, and what does that relationship with a car actually feel like from the inside? Or did you come to the Minor later, as a collector, and find something in it that the cars that replaced it never quite provided? Leave it in the comments. The Minor's history is partly in the records, and partly in the people who are watching this, and the part that is in the people is the part I would most like to read. If this was worth your time, a like and a subscription are appreciated. Thank you for watching.